I care so much because I've known people have gone through trauma. People ask how I don't burn out doing this. And the answer is I've seen how EMDR works. And when you take the emotional vividness out of someone's negative memories, and when you take the negativity out of the memory, then the prognosis is so great. Yeah. And you see such recovery. And so that's what fuels me.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Donor Supported Wednesdays with Watson podcast. Our mission here is simple. You guys know it by now. It is to educate and help people navigate trauma as well as other mental health issues. We are doing that and have done that almost for 2 years now by providing help and hope through the stories of myself, through the stories of others, and like today, bringing professionals on who are so kind to come on and help us. Finally, we have a mission to raise money for pro bono counseling for those who cannot afford it. If you want to be part of that mission, click on the Contact Amy button in the show notes. Also, I would love it if you would rate and review or share the podcast while you're in the app. We will never, ever stop fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. You guys know this by now. So now that we got all of that out of the way, let's walk into that healing zone. Today, I'm excited to bring back to the microphone licensed therapist and EMDR consultant, Jeremy Fox. As a disclaimer, Jeremy is appearing on the podcast out of a desire to educate. He has been published in academic papers and enjoys imparting knowledge. His words here today are meant for entertainment purposes only and are not meant to be a substitute for therapy. Jeremy Fox, aka The Trauma Tamer, also has a podcast. You can listen to it on Overtake. We'll put that in the show notes. He is one of my favorite people in this space. I met him on the Clubhouse app. He truly cares about people, y'all. I see him in rooms all the time, giving up time to help people understand trauma, and that is why he is here today. I want to pick Jeremy's brain today as we're in this series of child abuse and trauma in the home. And I wanted to pick Jeremy's brain about how trauma affects the developing brain of a child. More importantly, Jeremy will help us understand how early intervention can mitigate some of that damage. His treatment modality is EMDR, which you've heard me talk about. It is also my treatment modality that I've had much success with, and so you're going to hear us talking about that a lot today. So here with me today is Jeremy Fox, aka The Trauma Tamer. Welcome back to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Amy. What's going on? How are you doing?
I'm doing well, my friend. I sure appreciate you doing this on a Saturday. We both have real jobs, as I call it. But I just, I've been excited about this because, you're just the real deal, Jeremy. And I wanted you to know that.
I appreciate it.
Anytime I see you, and I'm saying this to the listeners too, if you're on the Clubhouse app, that app, like anything else, can be used for evil or it could be for good. But Jeremy is part of a group of professionals on Clubhouse who get on there and they hold space for people and provide educational resources. Like Clubhouse, like this podcast, is not therapy, but Jeremy gives up a lot of his time to help people understand trauma. And so I just wanted to publicly thank you for that, Jeremy.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that you are drawing attention to it, to the importance of treating trauma with empirical methods. There's just so much disinformation. So I'm really passionate, and I know you are too, and that's where our mission really intersected and we found each other, is spreading the word that EMDR therapy works and there is help, there is hope.
Amen. Amen. Even if you're not a Christian, and I tell people that all the time, and my podcast tends to be it is very faith focused, but I do want people out there to know that, hey, if you don't share my faith, there is still a treatment modality out there that will help you. And so we are in the back half of our season where we are discussing trauma and adverse childhood experiences in the home. Our mission here today is not to scare people, and that's funny because that was a quote that I took from when you were on the podcast before. I'm not trying to scare people here, but you're really good about giving us the real of what happens to the developing brain of children when trauma is present. Mm-hmm. And then you'll also bring hope, as you just mentioned. So I just want to jump right in. I want to start simple for understanding. We have two sides of our brain. One is our emotional side, or some people may hear the word limbic, and the other is responsible for the linear thinking, so the things that make sense to us, the things that make 2 + 2 always equal 4. Can you expound just a little bit about the two sides of our brain and their functions for our listeners? Because not everybody has a pre-med degree like I do.
Sure, I can go a little bit into that. I mean, the left and right divide is a helpful heuristic, meaning just like a memory device. It's something people can kind of keep in mind that we have a cognitive side and emotional. If you really want to kind of do an easy but deep dive, you can look at it as you've got things like your prefrontal cortex, which I know we're going to talk about. You have your limbic system, your hippocampus, and your amygdala. And so a really helpful way that I learned, and we're getting into like the triune brain model here, which again, there's some simplification there. The further out you go in terms of like the closer you get to the skull, the more things are on the surface of the brain in that model, the more advanced the function. So if you get like the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for your really cognitive control, attention, impulse, inhibition, perspective, memory, cognitive flexibility, all those kinds of things. It's prefrontal cortex kind of in the name there. And inside here, you have your limbic system. So the amygdala, which when active causes you to focus on survival. And so, and left and right hemisphere stuff, there's a little overlap in both, but generally what we're talking about is this idea that we can put things in time with left brain and say, okay, this is linear, versus right brain, which the timeless quality of memories, creativity, linkages that are very kind of spaghetti, but generally, yeah, we're talking about hemispheric differences. Maybe we're talking about frontal lobe versus limbic system kind of things as well when we talk about logic versus emotion.
Yeah, and that was very, very, I love the way you brought that down to the level. And so, yes, both sides of the brain, each responsible for different things, the emotion obviously in the right, and that is where what I call the trauma loop, and this is where EMDR comes in, and we'll talk about more about that a little bit more. But you mentioned the prefrontal cortex, and again, as a fancy word, it just means it's responsible for a whole lot of the things that you do, and you just told us that. Why does the PFC go offline when we experience trauma or when that amygdala is activated? Why does the PFC go offline?
So great question. And so I'll give the boring part first, right? So research shows that high levels of catecholamine chemical release during stress impairs your top-down cognitive functions of the PFC. My gosh, what does that mean? It means that when you're stressed, your prefrontal cortex goes offline, right? When we say that, we mean that there's some chemicals released. And then what's interesting is the emotional and habitual responses of the amygdala, okay, and the basal ganglia are strengthened by that chemical release. So now let's put it in the fun, blunt terms, okay? When you are threatened in some way that puts your life at risk, you're going to need to get out. You don't have time to sit and reason with that. Now, normally with something like a bear or a shark or a car accident, something coming towards you quickly, you need to veer out of the way in your car. That's helpful. You don't sit and reason with a car accident. That would be absurd. But what happens is if someone experiences something horrifying and it's imprinted in that flashbulb memory way, and they're so immobilized and helpless combined together in that way that we know that Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk would describe trauma, then this feeling, this sensation of whatever happened, the feelings and emotions, even the belief I'm not safe, can then cause that memory to activate, the amygdala to activate, and your prefrontal cortex to not be functioning at times when it needs to. So when you're nervous about a work staff meeting, when something happens where you don't need to have your prefrontal cortex cease working, that's really the damaging element of trauma. Is the event itself happened and you survived it. Your PFC is implicated in a lot of higher order things like your motivation, your ability to maintain and sustain attention. If you can't do that, your quality of life is severely diminished. And so that's the real crime of trauma, is continually diminishing your ability to function in the present in a way that's your authentic self.
And that's why you and I are doing what we're doing, right? Because
That's true.
it's so true. I mean, this affects us, but it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be the end of the story. So
No, not at all.
and it's not the end of the story, because of people like you, EMDR consultants across the country, that are saying, guys, it doesn't have to be this way. And so we're going to use a fancy term called neuroplasticity, and it's important when we talk about the confines of your modality and the treatment modality that's worked for me. And we are going to get back to the developing brain. But tell us a little bit about neuroplasticity, because, you'll hear anybody that's, out there trying to be their own psychologist or therapist or whatever, they'll hear the words that you're probably going to say to too, neurons that wire together, fire together, and all the things. But so we talked about that right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. Now we're going to introduce this word neuroplasticity. It belongs in that conversation. Could you explain to my listeners again, who don't have a pre-med degree, what neuroplasticity is?
Yeah, I mean, it simply put, if you want the definition, and we'll talk about it, the ability of the brain, okay, to form and reorganize, so reassemble synaptic connections. And so the synapses are little gaps between neurons that communicate via electrochemical means. Okay, and especially neuroplasticity refers to response to learning or experience, okay, or following injury. So the ability to reorganize your cognitive frameworks, your neural networks, is what neuroplasticity refers to. So essentially anything that's a sustained learning pattern. So you've learned something new and you do something new.
Yeah.
And so you can really judge how effective a therapy is, by the way, based on if you learn a different response to something that would normally have caused you to react with avoidance or an anxiety attack. Yeah. And that gets into the window of tolerance, by the way, from Dan Siegel, because if you've learned something new, then you
expand that window of tolerance, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
These terms all go together, essentially. And by the way, you have more prefrontal cortical control.
Oh my
So
gosh.
they all go together and this toward the same end.
We are geeking out right now. This is why I love Jeremy Fox, the trauma trainer, because on the podcast, and some people who are listening to this episode may not have listened to other episodes, we've talked about the window of tolerance and why one person can experience one trauma. Basically, two people can be. My friend and I were in a car accident right after Thanksgiving, and we're both fine, and there was no trauma. But I could have walked away from that car accident traumatized, and she would have been fine. And that is as a result of many psychologists will say trauma is anything that pushes your brain outside of this window of tolerance. Can you explain to us, in your words, what a window of tolerance is? Because we can both, when we're pushed outside of that window of tolerance, be hypo and hyper in our behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. I use that term a lot. And again, it's from Dan Siegel, who's written amazing books like Mindsight. He writes quite a bit about parenting, by the way, and how to do so in a trauma-informed way. So his book, The Developing Mind, is like a go-to for many people wanting to understand. And that's where this term came from, wanting to understand the brain. So I kind of like to use and maybe you can attach a graphic to the podcast or here or something like that. But one of the ideas is that you have this window, okay, that is your optimal zone of functioning. And so, by the way, your brain would be online with your prefrontal cortex. You would feel in some way capable of whatever's going on. It's your optimal stress level, eustress, which is EU stress, right? Rather than distress, which is what you normally hear about. So your optimal level of functioning is a sort of calm focus, not a depressed lack of focus, which would be which would be hypoarousal, by the way. And so when you're dealing with trauma survivors, what often happens is that window is truncated. It's smaller, right? So it takes less stimulation to reach hyperarousal, which is your sympathetic nervous system fight or flight response. So racing thoughts, anxiety, impulsivity, rage, even feeling out of control, obsessions and compulsions. These kind of things, I have people imagine at the top end, because that's hyper arousal. It's a lot of arousal, okay? And then at the lower end, the hypoarousal, that's the freeze response. Now, anyone who listens to Amy and myself regularly will know that the freeze response is often, okay, a result of childhood trauma. Why is that? Because when someone experiences something threatening as a child, they'll usually respond by freezing because they know they can't fight or flee. There's that childhood helplessness. And so then we carry that, again, neuroplasticity. We learn that and we carry that with us unless we learn that we can fight flee, socially engage. And that's where, if you've learned that through EMDR or other trauma-informed therapies like somatic experiencing, then there's the neuroplasticity of, you've just learned that you don't have to freeze. But the freeze response is what it sounds like. You zone out. There's memory loss, dissociation, right?
Yeah, and isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that Peter Levine calls the freeze response a result of locked up tension that has to be released before you can re-enter the zone, because that gets into really geeky stuff of a paper I wrote about the Zeigarnik effect, and how actualizing your interrupted impulse that you wish you had been able to express during trauma, if that's fleeing, if that's fighting, whatever, helps to actually put the trauma behind you. In other words, consolidate the memory and be done with it. And EMDR helps with that.
Boy, does it ever. And you and I could geek out forever about that. And,
Sure.
and we're going to continue to do work together, both here and everywhere else. But as my listeners know, I am an EMDR patient. Wow, I'll try to say that fast 3 times. And had basically brain scans that were improved from trauma having done physical damage to parts of my brain. So speaking of that, one of the very cool things about today that we're doing this, I sent you a message. I was like, Jeremy, I just had the most amazing life-altering EMDR experience. And maybe one day I'll get behind this microphone and tell listeners about what actually happened. But I started doing some inner child work, mainly because I'm researching for this series, and I have really avoided my inner child stuff. And so we started doing some inner child work, and I had a breakthrough. Like I can't even explain it to you. I came home and I told my friend Chrissy that I feel free for the first time from some childhood, particularly sexual abuse, after having done an EMDR session. So I was a child, Jeremy. We know that the brain continues to develop. It depends on who you ask. But most people say we're completely developed at 25. But tell me, and I think this is really important, and you've done a great job of understanding the focus of this podcast for parents who have children who have experienced trauma, or people like myself who have experienced trauma as a child, to help us understand that we aren't broken, that trauma actually does something to the developing brain. So one of the things that, Jeremy, I wanted to ask you about the developing brain and neglect. Right.
Yes.
Okay. Because that's my story, and that is the story of some listeners. And we and really, we're going to focus here on neglect, because I feel like that's really important for this series that we're working on. Like, what does abandonment do to a developing brain? And so, can you speak to that? Because abandonment, and I've experienced it, is it has been the hardest thing for me to heal from. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what neglect does to the child? And then we're gonna back that up with how we can help people.
Sure. Neglect. I mean, neglect is something that causes the neurogenesis of the brain. It causes a lot less development, and causes some impoverished emotional functioning. There's smaller amounts of gray and white matter in kids with childhood trauma in the prefrontal cortex compared with those who didn't report.
I have that.
And we're talking about ACEs now. We're talking about adverse childhood experiences, which involve like active trauma, instability in the home, viewing your mother being abused, people doing drugs in front, different things like that. The hippocampus is smaller in people who report early exposure to trauma, and that's associated with learning, that structure. So that can cause deficits in being able to learn. And so this is just sad stuff. I'll rattle off some more. I mean, the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional reaction center that correlates with survival instincts, has increased reactivity, okay, with higher reported exposure to trauma during infancy and early childhood. And again, if you want to kind of discuss what that looks like, that involves the ACEs content there. There's varying degrees of cognitive impairment and emotional dysregulation that happens with kids depending on the degree of trauma, because all trauma is not the same. And that can cause things like attention focus issues, by the way, that can mimic ADHD or exacerbate ADHD. Learning disabilities, low self-esteem, that's a given. Impaired social skills and sleep disturbance caused by chronic arousal, like feeling unsafe, caused by a poverty of experience, of positive experience, of, in other words, engagement with a caring adult figure. And it's such a spectrum. That's why people are proposing that CPTSD be an official. It is in the ICD, I believe, the International Code of Disease, but not in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Stats Manual. So, and that's, I mean, there's single episode PTSD, which you had brought up earlier as sort of the experience with Sandy Hook or Columbine. That would be a terrorizing event that could bring back flashbacks and cause a child to feel unsafe around loud noises, around confined spaces. But if that child up till that point, let's say they're 11 or 12 or even in high school, had a supportive environment, then it's not likely to change their entire identity if they have a healthy, because you look at it as an immune system. You look at someone's emotional well-being and their social network, their supportive family, they have a strong mental immune system. So if a traumatic event happens, that traumatic event will probably be confined to something that reminds them of that situation. So again, hallways, loud noises, they may go into that memory, but they may not have an entire paradigm change of I'm a worthless person, I'm fundamentally unsafe in the world. It might not infiltrate that neural network because they already know I matter. My grandma loved me. My parents loved me. Like, they have a narrative in place. So if you have EMDR right away for that event, that's like triage care where you're pulling out a splinter because you're stopping that memory from becoming something that their brain can't metabolize. They're not rehearsing it over and over and over again. You're stopping it from going into that state dependent form, and it's going into a more semantic form of this happened, this was a thing that occurred, and I'm not experiencing it as an intrusive, timeless event. It was terrible, but it's over. Whereas someone with neglect and trauma in that way, their whole identity is I don't deserve someone talking to me. So you have to do a lot more rebuilding, but it all can be done, by the way.
Thank you. I think that that's a beautiful segue, and I'm a great example of that, right? And so, and Jeremy and I, we geek out on this stuff because we love it and it works. So what Jeremy's just beautifully outlined for us is again what trauma does to the developing brain. We don't have all of our resources at our fingertips at 7 as we do 26. And so he's done two things here. He's talked about something that's very near and dear to my heart is neglect. A lot of my listeners have adopted children from other countries, and they have experienced all kinds of trauma. They've been abandoned, neglected, abused, all of the things that aren't supposed to happen in our homes. And the place that we're talking about in this part of the series is the home. And so I've read articles of babies not being picked up and loved, and how you can have lower IQs and all the things, right? And I often wonder, I don't know what it was like in my infancy. I know what it was like when at my first memory, and it was neglect. And so you've done a beautiful job of saying, hey, if you are out there and you've been neglected and you feel all of these things, or not feel all of these things, this is your life, this is your reality, there is hope. And then conversely, we talked about a little bit trauma when we experience in a different trauma, like Jeremy said, a single event trauma like Columbine or Sandy Hook, or you actually could name anything at this point, whereby even so Sandy Hook was an elementary school, Columbine was a high school. If we can get there and we can get to it quickly, that's a beautiful description. It's like pulling a splinter out, and those memories never have the opportunity to take form. And then therefore we can reverse the effects of the smaller amygdala, the truncated window of tolerance. Okay, Jeremy just told us beautifully what trauma does on the brain of a developing child. It truncates that window of tolerance. It makes the amygdala smaller. I love how he referred to the mental immune system. Basically, you don't have one. And so many of you out there, particularly if you are dealing with childhood trauma that is neglect, are walking around with these behaviors that you don't understand. And there's so much shame in those behaviors. I know that because I lived that life. I didn't understand why I needed so much attention having been neglected. And I talked about the babies who were never hugged and the things of that nature. And so I will always wonder, Jeremy, about that. And again, these things, neglect especially, do cause some scary things like lower IQs and lower ability to deal, and definitely, like we just talked about, the truncated window of tolerance, meaning the slightest thing can set people off who have had childhood trauma, particularly that of neglect. But there's hope. because you know that you're on the Wednesdays with Watson podcast, and I'm not going to leave you without hope. And so, as I mentioned, and then Jeremy and I has mentioned a couple times now, he is an EMDR consultant, and I am going to let him explain to you what EMDR is and why it works, and why, just like he said, it doesn't have to be the story. If you were neglected, or you know somebody was neglected, or you have some sort of childhood trauma, whether it be a single event like something as atrocious as Columbine and Sandy Hook, or neglect, or anything in between, there is hope, and EMDR is one of those modalities. So, Jeremy, can you explain to us what EMDR is and why it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. So that's a mouthful, but it was a therapy discovered by Francine Shapiro um, in 1987 when she was walking around in a park and she noticed her eyes rapidly moving between some trees while thinking of a negative memory or a memory with some negative emotions attached. And she noticed a decline in the vividness of the emotion. So she began studying the eye movement component in her graduate program, studying to be a psychologist. And she titled the new method EMD, or eye movement desensitization. And then she eventually added the R on in 1991 because she noticed that the recognition of she noticed the cognitive reprocessing effect. She recognized that so often what would happen is that memory would link to others. People might think of an earlier instance, for example, where they felt powerless. So maybe it initially started with something like a car accident, and they felt powerless, and maybe they remembered that they didn't have any say in their home, or they felt frightened constantly in their home life. But she studied the eye movement effects, and more research has been done in recent years from 87 onwards. So that's decades of research here. And what's really important to keep in mind is that this is an interrupted exposure therapy. Okay, Francine called it interrupted exposure in a book that she wrote about EMDR protocol. So this is not prolonged exposure. For listeners, I don't want them to think they're going to have to sit and think and think and think and really experience the trauma. The beautiful thing about EMDR is the eye movement is offered, which provides a present focus, and it helps to connect memories. We know that eye movements are implicated in memory retrieval, right? Yeah. Fancy terminology for we often move our eyes when we're trying to remember things. So it keeps you in the present, and it helps you to keep the memory train moving along, which is a big metaphor we use in EMDR, is where it's a train moving through. We want the client to notice the scenery outside while they're moving their eyes outside the train, but we don't get stuck in it. We keep it moving through the memory. We're on the train together with the client, and they're the guide, and we're there with them, and we're experiencing this. We're saying, okay, don't get stuck on the things outside the window. So we believe that EMDR, the eye movement, taxes the working memory, and it causes people to experience the memory less vividly because they're distracted. One of the very interesting geeky things to keep in mind about EMDR is that there's evidence that delta waves, so slow waves in the brain, activate during bilateral stimulation, which again, the eye movement, we call it that. It's bilateral, side to side. Delta waves activate in the brain, which is much like those observed during slow wave sleep. So delta waves are active during slow wave sleep, which is a time of transfer of memories from hippocampus to the neocortex. So transforming the memory from episodic to semantic. So again, a mouthful. So let's boil it down. EMDR therapy takes traumatic memories. It helps the client to sensitize to them by thinking of the elements, and then purge and desensitize with the eye movement and navigating the memory in a way that puts it in a past form. It binds that memory to the past instead of it coming up as present focused, which we know people with PTSD and even subclinical trauma without PTSD experience traumatic memories as present focused. In the present, they feel like it's happening now. EMDR stops that from happening. And again, there are many different hypotheses we can go down that rabbit hole on if anybody wants further info. I wrote an article summarizing the science behind it, but we always prep people too. I really want listeners to know you're not thrown into your memories. You're taught eject buttons. You're taught how to imagine putting them into a container, how to imagine a calm place using your eyes as well. But the goal of EMDR is reprocessing, is dialing up the negative the memories in session, navigating them, taking the emotions out. You're never going to approve of the memory. You're not going to say, I enjoyed this happening, but you're going to be able to say, I don't feel it in here anymore.
Yeah, and
It's a big difference.
and Jeremy's pointing. And so am I now. We're on Zoom, holding. He's pointing to. I
Mhm.
don't feel it in the center of my chest, and I think that I know that I've experienced that myself, and so there is hope, guys. And this does tie into that neuroplasticity, because you're literally, that train is going from the trapped limbic system where the memory is stuck, and on a loop is what I call it. I call it a trauma loop. And
Right.
that train is moving through. One of the things, Jeremy, that my counselor does, and I'm going to go ahead, and I wasn't sure when I was going to do this, but one of the things that we do after we visited
Mhm.
this memory, and again, it's not fun, but there is hope. And if you're in a safe place like in Jeremy's office, or if you're in Florida, so we got Florida and Georgia covered for 2 EMDR therapists. I know, I'm not sure where Nitty is, but we can provide resources for other states for you guys. But so when my last EMDR session, we visited the childhood trauma, but at the very end, my counselor likes to leave me with the truth, and he likes to weave in those truths. And so we were talking about some childhood neglect and sexual abuse trauma that happened when I was 7 years old. And he was writing on a board, and I have it in front of me, and we put a picture of 7-year-old Amy up on this board. And he asked me, he helped me understand who I was at 7, because my perception by my intrusive memories and all of those things now were none of these words. And so I'm holding the paddles. We do the paddles, the bilateral stimulation. You can do the eye movement. I hold the paddles. And he had me, so we had written these things on the board. He had me write these things. And I speak this into the people that are listening to this podcast. If you have experienced childhood trauma and you feel unworthy, if you've experienced sexual abuse and you feel unclean, especially in the Christian environment, in the Christian world, and we can go a whole nother podcast on that, with the sexual
Mhm.
purity culture and childhood sexual abuse, it does a lot to our brains. And so in that EMDR session, this is what we were able to weave after we reprocessed, after we got on that train and we plowed through from my emotional side to my left and linear and logical side. This is the truth that he weaved into me as I'm holding the EMDR paddles, and he made me read them out loud. And listeners, this is for you too. I am whole, worthy, innocent, pure, untouched, untainted, clean, free, carefree, enough, worthy. And so I'm holding the paddles, and he makes me read those. And now I believe that, because I don't, when those memories, and I've got some very specific things that do pop up from PTSD, a particular smell from Jeremy. I don't know how much of my story you know, but I was babysat and abused by a well-known serial killer whose name is Henry Lee Lucas. And there's a certain smell that happens in all of our homes at one point or another, and it's simply dirty dishes in the sink. And when that smell comes, that memory pops up, and I feel like I'm 7 years old again in that room being abused. And then all of the negative stuff that goes with it. I am dirty. I am unclean. I deserved it. Why didn't I tell somebody? Because I am treating my 7-year-old Amy like I am 50, as I am now. And so I bring that to the forefront because Jeremy is doing such good work in this EMDR. And I'm just giving you my example that happened on Thursday. Man, I left there, Jeremy, and I was like, I am free of that now. And when those intrusive memories might pop up again when I smell dirty dishes, but I will be able to say, I am clean. I was innocent. I was a child. I am untainted. I am untouched. I am new. I am worthy. I am loved. And that is because of EMDR. You do so much of this for free, frankly. Why do you care as we close out the podcast? Why do you do what you do, Jeremy? Because I can't overemphasize how much I appreciate the work you're doing on the Clubhouse app. And guys, all of his contact information is going to be there. He is paired up with some amazing professionals on there. Again, Clubhouse does not equal therapy, but they dispel mental health myths and all the things. Why do you care so much?
I care so much because I've known people have gone through trauma. I've seen an amazing mentor at my first clinical job who encouraged me to get trained in EMDR, and I worked with people who had gone through so much, multiple episodes of abuse, trauma, neglect. And I began using EMDR, saw it was effective. And I've seen that trauma underlies addiction, anxiety, personality disorders. What we know is those trauma is often responsible or at least fueling it. And so to me, I'm biased. It's one of, if not the most important mental health aspect. People ask how I don't burn out doing this. And the answer is I've seen how EMDR works. And when you take the emotional vividness out of someone's negative memories, and when you take the negativity out of the memory, then the prognosis is so great, and you see such recovery. And so that's what fuels me. But I mean, people in my own life, I've seen them recover, and it's really inspiring.
And frankly, that's why I'm continuing to do what I do. I mean, I got, I get messages from listeners who have listened to podcasts, and particularly ones like this, where folks like you have come on and brought it down to the basic level. Because what we've done here today through both academic and then I shared, and I wasn't sure when I was going to share, if ever I was going to share that EMDR session. But I can tell you guys, if you've been following my story at all, if this is the first time you've listened to one of my podcasts, just head back anywhere. There's several episodes, especially the first season, where I talk about my trauma, because I do have CPTSD, even though it's not in the very outdated DSM book that is around for mental health disorders. And so I am a survivor of neglect. I am a survivor of lots of childhood trauma. My brain was affected, but here I am. And that is why I do what I do too. And that is why we got on this podcast behind these microphones on a Saturday, so that Jeremy could provide hope and help for those of you out there who either have experienced all of these things or who are parenting children who are experiencing or have experienced, particularly I'm thinking adoption trauma and some of the things. Neglect is huge. It really is. And that's something we could have a whole other podcast episode on. But the whole point here, Jeremy, today was to provide hope for people and to help them understand the brain and help them understand that the developing brain, while trauma could really scar it, but boy, if we get in there early, it's so malleable. We can make it act, it could be like it never happened if we get there early. And that, guys, is why I do this podcast. That is why we raise money for people who can't afford counseling, including children and or adult survivors of neglect, abuse, and all the things. And so, Jeremy, thank you for being here today. Any parting words for our listeners? And after that, I will tell everybody where they can find you.
My parting words would be, no matter what trauma you've been through and how bad it seems and how low you feel about yourself, please realize that it can change, that's your mind and your cognitive framework. We talked about neuroplasticity today, and where it comes in is the ability to grow. So please recognize that EMDR therapy from someone who is certified, someone who's an approved consultant, I'm using the two highest certifications there, can very likely help you on your journey to developing better self-esteem and functioning. And addictions, OCD. We haven't even talked about the fact that EMDR works for a multitude of conditions.
Not just trauma.
So please don't give up hope. That would be the one thing I'd part with, is there is hope. Believe me. I was a skeptic initially of different therapy modalities, but I've seen what happened as a practitioner. And so please recognize, this is not Kool-Aid. We're not. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, it's been around since the 90s, Francine Shapiro. I'm going to put all of that in the show notes, including the article that Jeremy references that he wrote. Jeremy is in the state of Georgia. I'm going to put how you can find him. Basically, I'm going to put his link tree in the contact information so that you could get to him on Twitter, Clubhouse, all the places. Like I said, he too has his own podcast that is on the Overcast platform. That will be in there. So if you're in the state of Georgia, Jeremy is a possibility for a trusted EMDR therapists. Because of the pandemic, most therapists figured out how to still do EMDR remotely. And so if you're in the state of Georgia, you will be able to reach out to Jeremy, and then we'll also be able to provide, I don't know where Nidhi is. Jeremy, where is Nidhi?
She's in Virginia.
Okay.
So, and you can find her, Nidhi Tiwari. She's awesome. So one thing you can think about here is that if you're, whatever state you're in, you can put in your browser bar, emdria.org, emdria.org, and you can enter in there what your zip code. You can enter your zip code, you can enter your city, you can enter your state, and you can search for an EMDR therapist. That's the easiest option for you to do that. People have found me on Psychology Today by the word trauma, because I have that in my profile. But for EMDR specifically, you can go to EMDR and you can sort by experience level: basic, trained, certified, consultant.
Perfect.
And everybody needs to start somewhere and has to.
Yeah, we'll also provide that link in the show notes. Obviously, if you're in Florida, I'm not sure that my doctor has taken new patients, but reach out to me and I can help you if you're in Florida. Well, Jeremy, thank you for being here today. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, Saturday. And here is a great time for me to say that I'm not sure that you're a Georgia Bulldog fan, but congratulations to the entire state of the national champion, University of Georgia football champions.
Thank you.
Go Dogs, go Dogs. I grew up in Jacksonville, and so we picked Florida or Georgia when we were kids, and I picked the Silver Britches, and so there you go. All right. Well, thanks, Jeremy, for being here today. I so appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
Okay, bye-bye. Well, guys, I hope that you enjoyed that episode with my friend and EMDR therapist, Jeremy Fox. I realized that it was more scientific in nature than perhaps we are used to on the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. But I love how Jeremy also provided hope through the scientific facts of what trauma does to our brains as children. Guys, it's never ever too late to heal. And so as we step out of the healing zone, and as Phil Baker's song plays us out of the podcast, we will be back here in 2 weeks as we continue this series, Trauma, Spaces, Places, and Aces, as we continue to dive into trauma in the home, specifically to childhood trauma. So I hope to see you back here in 2 weeks. Again, would love to connect with you. Hit that Contact Amy button. Would love for you to follow on Instagram, particularly in the month of April, as we will be doing some fun stuff on that platform. So I will say it like I always do, because I mean it. You are seen, you are known, you are heard, you are loved, and you are valued. See you guys in 2 weeks.
Let my life glorify you and teach me to walk beside you. And I want to be more like you, so let my life be one marked by you. Marked by you, marked by you.
On this Saturday morning, there was a large explosion. I was laying, like I said, on the couch, and I heard this really large boom. Our garage door flew open, and I remember running around and looking out into the garage and seeing the whole side of our garage wall on fire.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. We are so proud to tell you that this is a 100% completely donor-supported podcast. Our mission here is simple. It is to educate and help people navigate trauma and other mental health issues. We do that by providing hope and help through story, through professionals, through education. Finally, we have a mission to fund pro bono counseling for those who cannot afford it. If you want to be part of that mission, right there when you're in your app, just click the Contact Amy button in the show notes. I would also love it if you would consider rating and reviewing or sharing the podcast while you're in your app. I will never ever stop fighting for those that can't fight for themselves, and a simple gesture like sharing or subscribing will help us get this mission out to the people that need to get it. Now that we got all of that out of the way, I would love to introduce you today to my guest, Amber Colum. Let's drop into this conversation with Amber. Hey, Amber, welcome to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast.
Hey, Amy. Thank you for having me on today.
It's always so much fun to interview other podcasters, and that is secondary. You are a dear friend of mine, and I am so grateful for your doing this today. So thank you so much for being here. I know that you understand it, and I'm not quite as nervous as I normally would be just because I know you understand the technology issues.
Absolutely, girl. I mean, it is a true struggle at times, that's for sure. But I'm so glad that it's even an option.
Yeah, that is the truth. That is the truth. Well, guys, we are in the second half of season 3 of the Wednesdays with Watson podcast that we're calling Trauma Spaces, Places, and Aces. We are focusing on trauma and mental health inside the home and how it affects children in adulthood. Today, we bring my friend, like I said, another fellow podcaster, Amber Cullum. She is the curator of the amazing, and this link will be in the show notes, probably above my name, Grace Enough podcast. Amber came to me with a message that she wants you to hear today, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So, as we have already welcomed in Amber to the podcast, I just would like to really invite you to sit back and listen to what she has to say to us today. And so, Amber, one of the things that we're doing in this season, and this has been a really interesting question that we've been asking people, and it's a bit of an icebreaker because, it's sometimes hard to say, tell me about you. People start, well, I was born in 1932. And so we like this question because we feel like it disarms the guest, and it really makes us think, and it's just kind of part of what's important to us here at the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. And so you do not get released from this season 3 question. So here it is. What is your favorite part about how God made you?
It's funny, when you sent me this question, I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe how hard this is for me to answer. And then I thought, she just finished a season with focusing on the Enneagram, and I'm an Enneagram 1, which means I have a strong inner critic. So it's very, very hard for me to think about things that I really, really like about myself. But that'll actually come out a little bit more in our conversation today. But what I did come down to is I do love that God made me someone who I cannot just sit back and not stand up for what I believe in. And I'm not just talking about faith. I'm talking about if I'm really passionate about something, if I see someone being wronged, I just have it in me to want to stand up, defend, be courageous, sometimes to my own demise. But that's probably what I appreciate most about the way that God has made me.
Oh, I love it. And I appreciate that about you too, as your friend, right? I love it when you get a bee in your bonnet, and so to speak, especially. And guys, if you're not following Amber on Instagram, you got to do that, right? And that also will be in the show notes. But yeah, when you, particularly as it pertains to things of the gospel, right? And these things that we have out there, these thought processes that we have out there that aren't right or whatever. I just love that sense of justice you have. We digress. Definitely go to her Instagram page. Well, I am going to jump right in here because as we were prepping for this interview, you landed, Amber, on something that was on your heart. And I think it is so, so important as we talk about trauma and mental issues in the home, that the message that you wanted to bring to us today because of your lived experiences is so, so important. And because you're a podcaster and able to speak for yourself, what is that message? What is the overarching message? And we'll get into the story, obviously. But you said something to me on Voxer, which is the way we prepped, and it sent chills down my spine, that you really felt like this is the message that our listeners needed to hear. What is that message?
I mean, I don't know that I can make it super concise, but if I can try to pare it down as much as possible, it's that just because you grew up in an intact family that was seemingly very put together and healthy does not mean that there wasn't trauma in the home, and that there aren't ramifications as an adult in response to that trauma, and that trauma doesn't always have to be the Amy Watson story. It can be very much dialed down, yet still have a significant amount of impact in how you parent, or how you're a spouse, or how you're a friend, or how you're a coworker as an adult.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing I want people to understand. It doesn't have to look like total abandonment.
And unfortunately, it often doesn't, right? So the Amy Watson story, or these big traumas, and and so for listeners, let's go back and review quickly what trauma is any time that your safety has been compromised. We all will go through trauma at times in our lives, but to Amber's point, we like to get stuck on these sensationalized stories, ones like mine, and we forget that there are inside the four walls of people's homes, things are happening that we don't know about. We all put our best foot forward in the social media version of the 1990s and 80s, right, Amber? We go to church, everybody looks fine, we're all good here, right? And so Amber's message is trauma doesn't always look like you think it looks. And so when we talk about a family like Amber's, who grew up in a Christian home with two parents, but Amber, there were two events that happened in your home that are trauma. What were those events? Because I think it's important that we set it for the listeners as we talk about how this affected you in childhood and the message that you just talked about. What were those two events that happened that absolutely qualify as trauma?
Yeah, I mean, well, let me say this first. I mean, I grew up in what I would consider a culturally Christian home, which is a little bit different than growing up in a home where you're like in the Word of God, where you're praying a lot at night and things like that. So culturally Christian, maybe not as familiar now, but people who are listening, if you're in the South, you kind of get that. Like, we just kind of do church sometimes, but it may not be like your true identity. And so that's where I would start. But the first thing, when I was in 5th grade, my house actually burned to the ground. And so I was a young girl laying on the couch on a Saturday morning. My sister had slept over at a friend's house. And now, let me also say that I grew up in a fantastic neighborhood where my dad built his home. My dad's brothers were my neighbors. So all of my cousins lived around me, and lots of other children and extended family were around me. And so on this Saturday morning, there was a large explosion. I was laying, like I said, on the couch, and I heard this really large boom. Our garage door flew open, and I remember running around and looking out into the garage and seeing the whole side of our garage wall on fire. And so I yelled and told my dad. Obviously at this point, a ton of commotion is going on. My mom runs down the stairs. My dad's like, get out of the house. We both run to 2 different houses across the street, knocking on the door, trying to get help, while my dad is trying to put out this fire. And so, long story short, the house ended up burning completely to the ground. And so, praise God, we had family and support around that we were able to go and stay with. But that was a huge traumatic event in my life, but certainly in the lives of my parents, which I still can't even fathom the impact it had on them, even now as an adult myself. And so that was the first thing. And then the other really big trauma is that when I was a sophomore in high school, we were living in a rental house, and this had been the story of our family since 5th grade. We had only lived in a couple of rental houses, but we were kind of in the process all of those years trying to figure out, my parents were, are we going to build again? Do we want to buy? And where I grew up, it's like I said, a small town, so it wasn't as easy just to go out and find a home that you wanted to buy. And so, especially when you're a family of 4, you're not just looking for something super, super tiny. But anyways, it was a night of a Christmas concert. I was in the honor choir at my school. We had a very large Christmas concert. My sister was a freshman in college. She was an alumni of this choir, so she was at home singing this night as well. I got super irritated that my sister was running late, and finally my dad just said, okay, I'll just take you, and then I'll come back and get your mom, and your sister can just go when she's ready. And I was like, awesome. And so we get in the car. It was really, really cold, December night, raining really hard. He takes me. I'm glad. My sister shows up, about 15 minutes after I do. And because at this point I couldn't drive. And not so much later, as we were preparing for the concert to begin, we were warming up. My mom comes in and says, "We've got to go. Your dad's been in an accident." And so at that point, it was like, what? And so it was a near fatal accident. He broke both of his legs. He crushed his ankle. He had to be intubated. One of his lungs collapsed. There were a lot more breaks beyond what I just mentioned. So he was life flighted to a hospital that was much larger. And there were several days where we did not know if he was going to survive this event. And even if he did survive it, what was the man going to look like coming out on the other side? Praise God, I can sit on this side of it and say, my dad did return to walking again. My dad did survive. But it was a trauma, to me personally, because it was my dad. But again, as for my parents, it's trauma that I can't even begin to fathom, because now as an adult, I can think about finances and, your parenting, the list is so long once you're an adult of what that impacts. So those are the two big traumatic events in my childhood.
Whew, and they are big, right? So because when we think again of the definition of trauma, with your safety being compromised, your house burning down, and one of your parents almost dying, wow, I can't even imagine and you keep referencing as an adult, and we are moving in a little bit of a different direction. We're not necessarily talking about how this affected you, but as your friend, I actually wrote down a question to ask you later about this, because I knew about the accident, but I'm not quite sure that I knew that he was taking you to a concert that you really wanted to go to. So I can imagine some of the stuff that you went through, but we do want to stay in where your heart's desire. And I think this is really important. But just so you know, my friend, those two things are considered by experts adverse childhood experiences, where you have a life-threatening event of a parent or yourself, and then basically your roof, you don't have anywhere to live. Those are two what we call adverse childhood experiences. If you get three of those, then we begin to talk about where you, Amber, can be affected by what we call toxic stress. And I would imagine if we talk longer, we probably could get to 3 or 4 adverse childhood experience score for you. And so just that's just a side note as your friend. But here's what I want to know, because I can't imagine now as an adult either what your parents must have gone through, both with the house burning down and with your dad almost dying in the car accident. And I realize that podcasting is going to be out there forever and ever, amen, and that we need to be careful here. But as comfortable as you are, I want to hand the mic to you. And can you remember how one or both of your parents responded to both of those or either one of those events? And how did the way they respond affect you now?
Yeah, when I was in 5th grade and our house burned down, I don't have a lot of memories of how my parents handled it and I think one of the biggest reasons why is because I was young, and also because we immediately moved in with my grandparents, and one set of my grandparents' home, and things didn't go so great there. So after like a week, we transitioned into my other set of grandparents' home, and that was very much a safe place for me. Like, I used to sleep in the back of my granny. Aww. Meaning when I was younger, I would like snuggle up in her back and just sleep there all night long. And I did that before my house burned. So it was a very safe place for us, or for me and my whole family, as we were homeless. And so I don't recall how that was dealt with as much. And I really do believe that's because I did have a safe place. So I didn't notice if my parents were arguing or how they were communicating with one another, because I had these two loving individuals who were taking care of me at the time. Now, with that said, I do remember after my dad's accident. There had transition for us anyways in that time. You know, we lived with my grandparents, then we moved into a rental house, and we lived in that rental house for, I think, like 2 or 3 years. And it was really a fantastic 2 or 3 years. And we were trying to decide if we were going to buy that house. My parents decided not to, when we had to move to a really small home because it was hard to find another house to rent. And that is where we lived when my dad had his accident. And I feel like at that moment, that is when my mom in particular, the stress of just caring for our family and working, in addition to things that had happened in her past, really began to play out. So it seemed like my mom was beginning to resort, or I don't know if that's the word that I want to use. She would begin to avoid more and more conflict. I mean, my mom was always explosive when she got angry. I can be very explosive when I get angry. But what ended up happening were things like, okay, I'm upset with you, and so I'm going to kind of berate you or belittle you, and then I'm going to disappear into my room for weeks at a time until I feel like I'm over it, and then I'll come out and act like nothing ever happened. And so I don't know that that's just a direct result of my dad's accident as much as it was stress over time piling up on her. And the way that she dealt with that stress was through avoidance and some manipulative type words. And then, of course, my dad is the type of, I'm just going to take care of the problem by doing, and people pleasing. And very much is just like, we got to keep the peace at all cost. So those could be two very polar opposite responses that when meshed together is fairly toxic.
Yeah, well, you know, it's funny that you mentioned the Enneagram series. It sounds like maybe your dad is a solid 9. Just like, like let's just keep it copacetic here. But I can imagine, and this is for the listeners and for you, Amber, these are the implicit messages that we are not hearing. And again, we referenced the Enneagram series, which is the beginning of this season. If you guys want to go back and hit some of those, Enneagram 1 is Amber's type. But my point being there, though, is that you don't really know what you don't know until you don't know it. And so you kind of went on through life and got married and had children. But when you and I were talking about this episode, this idea of, listen, guys, we need to make sure that people out there understand that inside the home, even though it looks like an intact family and your family was intact, it sounds like you were loved well, doesn't sound like you missed a meal or any of the things, but we take our cues, we take our social cues, and we particularly take our coping mechanisms, we take those play sheets out of the playbooks of our parents. For a parent to isolate away from you does even more harm to you as a child and your brain. Now, the sophomore in college might not as much, but the younger one, all of those things get laid down in your memory, Amber, and you look at a parent and you model that, and it's like, well, this must be the way we deal with hard things. And it sounds like you kind of landed on that. And so you're on the other side of it. Clearly, you are married with 3 beautiful children. But this is what you wanted to talk about on my podcast, because you recognize, look, just like you just said, I blow up sometimes. You recognize, you know what, maybe I didn't get a lot of modeled for me of how to handle trauma. And so that's my message to the listeners out there is think about the kids in your lives, teachers, youth pastors, anybody that has purview over young people. Think about what you don't see. And in this case, no one saw Amber's mom in her room. They just maybe didn't see her out in the community. And so I think that that's really important to point out there. Clearly, you somehow, through counseling or because you're just super smart or because the Lord really impressed this upon you, is like, you know what, that's not a great way to deal with trauma and to deal with issues. I don't want to do that. And so my listeners are going to want to be the same. They're not going to want to do that. They're going to want to model for their children of how to handle these traumatic events that come into our lives. Can you share with our listeners what you've learned on your journey and how maybe you really stay away from this particular unhealthy coping mechanism of isolation, blowing up, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, let me share this really quick too as we go into that. When I was a senior in high school, and really this is a very much a traumatic event, and I shared this with you, Amy, and I think it's important because of the way that it shaped my young adult life. I said some really hurtful things, and my mother chose not to speak to me for 5 months. And, you know, we lived in the same house. So my mom, my dad, my sister, and me, my senior year, we went 5 months because I really hurt her, where we just were like, you know, passing in the wind. I found myself as a college student with my roommates when I would get irritated with one of them or angry with one of them or not see eye to eye with one of them, I would just do that. Like I would just totally avoid them and for weeks or months just not talk to them. And then I was a young married woman, like I guess I was 28 or 29. I got in an argument with Sam and I just went away, like not away for days or anything, but for like the afternoon. I think that I went to some restaurant and just sat and blew off steam and probably wrote and read. And when I came home, he was like, you can't do that. Like, you can't just get mad and then disappear and no one knows where you are. And I remember at that moment, something clicking in me and thinking, okay, this is not okay. This is like totally, it's just not okay. But I also knew there had to be some way to find space to process through things. But, you know, it was like, what do I do here? And so through lots of, and we'll talk about this later, counseling and working through different books and, you know, support groups and all these different things, because during that time, I mean, I was a follower of Jesus. I was a follower of Jesus in college. Like, I was so grateful to God for the things that he had done in my life. Like, he had changed me, but there were still these horrible habits that were just hanging on, right? Like, and they're still being sanctified out of me.
Yeah.
That's something I want people to hear is, yes, you are a new creation in Christ when he saved you, but his work is not complete in you until the day of Christ Jesus. And so don't think new creation means that all of the impacts of trauma in your life just get up and walk out the door.
Thank you for saying that, because I think that especially Gen Xers, that's what got preached to us, right? And I wanted you to share that story about your mom not speaking to you, and she still does that to you, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so obviously you recognize Sam, who is your husband, said, look, you can't do this. And so I'm so glad to hear you say that, because as you create a normalization of mental health in your own home, right, where you have 3 precious children who you want to grow up and not have wounding messages from, and all parents do it, but this that you've hit on is so important because they're going to model what they see. And so these things that you learned as a coping mechanism, and I got my coping mechanism of substance abuse from my mom as well. I'm convinced.
Yeah, I mean, we all have it.
Yeah, 100%. And parents out there, don't think, oh, I got to be perfect. That's my concern with this series, is that parents like Amber, loving parents, are going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to screw my kid up. No, but we want to normalize mental health in the home. We want to say it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be mad. It's okay to be confused, but let's talk about it. We don't leave. And so is that something that you've established in your home with your kids?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that was the thing. That's why I wanted to tell you about how I just got in this habit of like, fine, then I'm just shutting you down and not talking to you, because it still is my default position.
Yeah.
Like, there is still this thing in me, and some of that can be blamed on my mother, and some of that can simply be blamed on, that may be the bent of my personality, is to just push it out and just be like, well, I'll just close you off. And what I came to realize, and this actually just happened in the last 2 years, that one of my biggest fears is that I'm going to lose your love.
Hmm.
And that is something that came from my mom, where, okay, if I mess up enough, there is a chance that I can lose your love. And I've ascribed that to God at times too. And so that's where that identifying and learning and digging deep and figuring out what are the lies that you believe are important. And so the very first thing with my kids is that I have talked about with them is forgiveness and admitting when you're wrong. Me first. I did not grow up in a home where I heard, I'm sorry for doing that, I was wrong. Now, with that said, that is a very common thing in families. And so it is vital to look at your kids. And I will never forget when when I asked him, I said, what do you think is different? Like, you grew up in a family where your parents were together, but it's not like they were perfect. I mean, you have family members who were explosive and angry, just like I do. And he said, the biggest difference that I see is that when one of my parents screwed up or, just flew off the handle, I remember them saying, I'm sorry. It's not okay for me to treat you that way.
Let's let that breathe for a second, because when you said that, it actually gave me chills.
Yeah.
Right? Because you say when a child sees that, you're beginning to create important neural pathways in their minds where they don't grow up being that adult. And so I just wanted that to breathe. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think it's really, really important, that delineation there between two intact homes, between yours and Sam's, right? Mm-hmm. And what an astute question for you to ask him is, what do you think is different? And the thing that he could come up with is, my parents would say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. And Amber, what that is nothing more than laying down pride, and emotionally healthy people can do that, right? And so the only thing I would say here, and this is a bit of an outlier as we continue the interview, is we always wonder, like with my mom, I will spend the rest of my life wondering, what happened to you that I am now I got your blood on me because you bled on me and I didn't cut you. And so we don't know that about your mom. And my prayer moving forward is that somehow this could be redeemed and restored. And if it's not, then we know it will inside of heaven. But I love what you just said, though, about just because we are Christians and new creations, I don't know that you realize a parent locking themselves in the room is what we call big T trauma, especially as a girl, right? And so, and I know you're sitting with a lot of that, and as we've processed this, there's been tears, and for me anyway, but what you've done, though, is my favorite thing. And I would doubt if there's a podcast without me referencing this Bible verse, but Joel 2:25, you're allowing the Lord to redeem those years that the locusts have stolen. It's very hard for me not to get preachy on my podcast, particularly to my friends. And so I love that. I love that your kids are seeing you and Sam, I am sure, saying I'm sorry a bunch. I have seen you on a public forum say I am sorry. And so I think that I love that those years are definitely being restored. Now, as your friend, I want to ask you some questions as we continue to lead into how childhood trauma affects us in adulthood, is the importance of taking care of your mental health. And in this part of the series, Amber, we're going to have Erica Cooney on, and she dubs herself as the burnout professor. And she deals a lot with adults who are burned out because they have not dealt with trauma as a child. And so that is my question to you on a personal level. So not related to your kids, not related to your family, but how are you taking care of yourself? Because I, with my little old biology degree, identified something when you were talking, and I'll just say it right here on this podcast, the perhaps guilt that you have over your dad in a car accident because you pushed to go to that concert. And so I want to know how you're taking care of yourself, because Erica's going to come on and say, if you don't pay attention to trauma, she's going to say what I've been saying for 3 seasons now. It will pay attention to you, and you end up being a burned out adult. You're the mom of 3, a wife, you're a podcaster, you are going to be a speaker. I got to make sure you're taking care of yourself. This stuff isn't going away. These effects on you from childhood, this is the point of the podcast, are going to stick around. Because again, to your point, just because all things are new doesn't mean that it's new and perfect on this planet. So these things are still going to affect you today, me and my Dr. Watson degree. I want to know how you're taking care of yourself.
Well, counseling. So I originally, back in, right after grad school, went to counseling for the first time because I knew I had a lot of things that I needed to work through. And so that was the very first step I feel like I took to really begin sorting through some things that I knew weren't right. Now, with that said, I have gone back to counseling 2 times and recently just started back again because I just started feeling like I'm not okay. Like I'm doing all of the things that I have been able to do in the past that usually kind of flip that switch of struggle, and it's not working. And so counseling provides a place where you can really talk things through, and someone can almost voice that back to you, and it helps you to actually hear someone else voice back to you what you're saying and what you perceive to be going on in order for you to kind of release it and begin to process it even with the Lord. So for me, prayer is a huge tool. Daily gratitude is a tool that really, really changed my life. I mean, talk about neural pathways. You start practicing gratitude, your life's going to change. But when I realized, like, okay, I'm still spending time in the Word, I'm still meeting with friends, I'm still asking for prayer support from people, I'm praying myself, and I'm still kind of in this really big funk. Or burnout, for lack of better words. I realized, like, okay, it's time for me to return to counseling. And sometimes it may not be counseling. Sometimes it's, I had read through Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Pete Scazzero, which is a phenomenal book that I would recommend anyone read.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, and it's such a great book, but there's also a course that goes along with it. So during a time when I was struggling somewhat, I wasn't in counseling, but my husband and I did decide to go through Emotionally Healthy Spirituality with a group. And that was incredibly helpful because it has questions at the end, and you're discussing those questions and you're thinking through, how have I put some of my childhood experiences, how have I applied that to the way that I view God? So those are the things that I do to take care of myself currently. I text people like you to say, man, today is just like bad. And so if you can just hold me up.
And that's
those are the ways.
And so you just hit on 2 of the C's of the, if anybody that listens to the Wednesdays of Watson podcast, we talk about, really, I just got behind this microphone when the pandemic started and said, this is what worked for me. And I'm a writer, so I love alliteration. Counseling, you already talked about that. Community, you talked about that as a family. And even now you do community so amazingly, and reaching out to people like me. This is why I love podcasting, guys. I've met Amber in person twice, but consider her a prayer partner and a prayer warrior. And I too will text her and go, dude, it's just a bad day. Would you please pray for me? And so I am so glad to hear that you are taking care of yourself, because one of the things that people don't understand about the kind of ministry that you and I both have in podcasting is you don't just get behind a microphone and say some words and hit a green button and call it a day. We care. And this is an opportunity for me to let you tell my listeners before we wrap up here, because I want them to know your heart for the Grace Enough podcast, particularly you of late have really felt like the Lord leading you in a little bit of a different direction. The podcast is phenomenal. It is in the top 2% globally ranked. You have gotten you're going to have John Eldridge, which I'm still praying over the bitterness of that. I'm not going to lie. But the Lord has given you such wisdom, as my listeners have heard here today, because you should not have been able to identify, I need to learn to cope better because I didn't have it modeled for me. And I do think, to your point, Amber, that some of it is the way we're wired. So it's not all because your mom didn't necessarily go to get help when she needed help. It is some of it is the way we were wired. We keep referencing the Enneagram series, and I will talk to anybody who will talk to me about it, but I have to go into friend mode and preacher mode really quickly here too, is that I believe you probably wing into that Enneagram too, which is me. The fear of being unwanted and unloved.
Mm-hmm.
And then, assigning that also to God, that there's something that I can do that would make me unwanted or unloved. I turned 50 years old in December. My mom is not on this planet, but I will never get the resolution and the peace, to your point earlier in the podcast, that I need from that. Like, she didn't want me and she didn't love me. And so I spent my life performing so that I would get those things, which turns into burnout. So you mentioned counseling, you mentioned community. You also have a heart, as I mentioned. And so here's where I want you to talk to us about the direction you hope to go in the near future for the Grace Enough podcast, because you are looking to minister to young women out there, particularly with stories of hope and help. And you are so well-versed on the gospel and the word, and it's important. And all of this is culminated into this big, giant heart that you have on the Grace Enough podcast. Tell us what you're headed for there, because we share a similar audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I love the most about podcasting, and you and I have talked about this, is it does give you an opportunity to really walk in someone else's shoes without judgment. And that is a rare opportunity. Like Mary Morantz was on my show a couple of weeks ago, and she talks about interviewing her mom, and her mom talk about trauma. Like, her mom left when she was 9, but then she was like home, once every 2 weeks. And then it was like once a month. And then it was like once every 6 months. And then it was like just on holidays. So she was kind of there, but not there. And she said, I sat behind the microphone with my mom and I went into interviewer mode so I could ask her these questions and have the emotional trauma of my childhood removed, because I was curious.
Wow.
And so when it comes to my show, I want to put a message out there of curiosity for people's lived experiences. And that doesn't always have to be like what you and I were talking about, the huge oh my gosh, my parents abandoned me and didn't love me. I mean, the reality is that when we come to realize that Christ loves us and he died for us, but there is so much more to a life with Jesus than just that.
Amen.
And that sounds like it's minimizing salvation. Oh, no, not at all. What's minimizing salvation to me is when we just preach John 3:16 at people and then just kind of, okay, that's it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, Jesus is pursuing you. He wants to totally transform your life, but that does not happen overnight. That is a lifelong, day-to-day walk until you leave this earth.
Amen. And so the near future of the podcast is for you to get people on your show and to provide a product on the field that is going to be useful for all of us, because when people begin to talk about lived experiences, because here's the thing, stories like mine get the airtime, but stories like this don't get airtime. And there are people sitting in their houses right now thinking, well, I don't have the Amy Watson story. I don't have this story. I don't have that story. And by the way, when you talk to people with lived experiences, we're both in a season of life where we are old enough to know better, but young enough to still do something about it. And so that wisdom that you're going to bring with these lived experiences, whether it be trauma, whether it be how do I live a real, authentic life in front of people who don't believe in God, because the question we get the most is, how can a good God do this for me? And we throw John 3:16 or a Bible at them, versus an episode of the Grace Enough podcast where they could say, Amber and her guests talk through this, and I can resonate with that. They're not throwing scripture at me, because I don't even believe that that's the absolute authority. And so I am excited for you as you move into this next season for the Grace Enough podcast. And again, I can't say it enough times, that link will be in the show notes. I want to end on one other question though, but I wanted to make sure we got that in there, because I'm excited to see what's coming to the Grace Enough podcast. If, guys, you feel like you have a message to share that meets Amber's heart, that meets my heart, this is the message, that you can live an abundant, victorious, although not always good. As Amber mentioned, she is suffering with depression. She's tried everything she can do to figure it out. But the fact of the matter is that we will not be perfect until that day when Jesus comes or we die. And if you have accepted Jesus as your Savior, then you also will find this complete healing. But we're not going to find it here. And if you need to know how to know the star of the story, and if you've listened to the Wednesdays with the podcast at all, that is Jesus and the completed work that he did for you on the cross. Please reach out to either one of us. If you have a story of lived experiences that you feel like would be beneficial to Amber's listeners, please reach out to her. Just click the contact Amber in the show notes, because she really wants to highlight real stories. And I bet, Amber, that you would even be willing to have, and I know you have already, have people who don't believe what we believe, and you sit and have a conversation with these people and love on them, because that's the only way some people will ever know our Jesus.
Yeah, and it's the only way that sometimes we can know why they feel the way that they feel. We have to hold space for people who don't believe like we do.
Yes. Let's let that breathe. We have to hold space for the people that don't believe like we do.
Listen, that's even in Christianity too, because
yes,
the older I get, the more I realize I don't even have all that much in common except
Jesus
Christ.
Yeah.
With a lot of Christians. So
that is so, especially right now, right? In 2022, especially. That is so true, especially right now. The last thing that I think that you really could add value here, we could talk for 4 hours and there'd be all kinds of value added, but we talk about church a lot on my podcast. It is an important part of my story. While some of my abuse came at church, church is still very, very, very pinnacle part of my story. But what would you say in the context of what we've talked about today? Intact families, trauma, perhaps the trauma not being dealt with in a healthy way by parents, it's passed on to kids who could pass it on to their own kids. You've got this strong message that you shared with us today. But what would you say to teachers, youth pastors, volunteers, anybody out there who have Ambers in their area of responsibility? They come dressed nice to parents. We're going to a restaurant after church. Money's not a problem. Those kids tend to get ignored. What can church leaders and teachers and lay peoples do to help in situations like yours? Should we just assume, hey, everybody in this room, every kid in this room needs us to invest in them in the most rudimentary, basic way?
Well, I'll say this. It's said that if a child has at least one adult in their life who really shows that they care, it can change that child's life. And so it's really easy. And mainly I'm going to speak to youth pastors here, since we're talking about children, and just children's pastors in general first. And that is, it's really easy to get caught up in what curriculum we're using, what we get up on stage and say, and all of that matters. It does. But you are only as good as the team that you foster around you, because it's the lay leaders, it's the volunteers who are meeting with these children in their classes, Sunday school classes. You don't have that much time. You may spend 1 to 3 hours a week with these children in church, But it's the ones who are serving in the small group that are getting the one-on-one time with children and with youth. Oh my goodness. And they need you. They need the one safe place where they feel like you're listening and that you're just there for them. Because a lot of times a child will tell you, let's say their small group leader, they'll tell you stuff they will not tell their parents, even when their parents are safe places. So that is important. You've got to foster your volunteers' leadership in them, showing them how to come alongside kids and just listen, be there, yet still pour the word of God in them without being all preachy. Well, there's no way that volunteers can do that if they're not in the word themselves and if they're coming from a place of judginess. And so I think that's my biggest thing for the church is just whoever's in charge, make sure you're fostering community and your volunteers, because those are the people like me who are leading a middle school small group. That's where the impact is. Yeah. Kids want to know that there's somebody willing to listen when they get in above their heads.
Oh, it's terrible news. And I am a product of youth pastors doing exactly what you just said. Maybe not quite as well as you just said. They didn't do it because, we learn.
Well, because we're humans.
Yeah, we're humans. But yeah, I think that that's such a great parting words, because in a church, we tend to not pay attention to the families with two parents, even absent of trauma. Let's just say Johnny experiments with pot and he's scared to tell his mom or dad, but his conscience telling him to tell somebody. If there's a safe place in the church, because we are talking about children, if there's a safe place, and I just use that example, but if there's a safe place for them to go, then that early intervention that we talked about in the first episode of this series of helping the minds, the physical brains of children heal will go far, and they won't have to end up in a psych ward like I did, or many things that so many times happens when there is unresolved or unmet trauma or unmet needs, which is to be wanted and loved and seen and heard and known. Well, Amber, thank you for being here today. I know that this might be the first place that you've discussed some of this, and so I'm incredibly, incredibly grateful. Listeners, I can't say it enough. Please head to the Grace Enough podcast and listen to Amber's. She's got a lot of episodes on there. Probably my favorite one is the one that she does with Sacred Rest with Sandra Dawson, I believe.
Sandra Dalton.
Yeah, Dr. Sandra Dalton is one of my favorites. But Amber has got over 150 episodes, top 2% globally. Please go check her out. Amber, the last words are yours, my friend. What else do you have for our listeners?
Oh my goodness, that puts me on the spot. Listen, as a person who loves Jesus and also is dealing with depression, please remember that it doesn't mean that you love Jesus any less or that you want to walk with him any less because you have a mental health disorder.
Amen. And it's okay to take medication. That's the message for me,
Amen.
Not necessarily from Amber. But, well, thank you for being here. I want to speak into your life, Amber. You are just the precious daughter of the Most High God, and he loves you more than you can ever imagine. And I know that you know that, but I know that sometimes you forget. In those dark places, remember that he is the God who sees you. I love, love, love that name of God. He is the God who sees you. And I am so proud of you for the work that you're doing in counseling. I know it's not easy, but if you're going to walk this world and raise little kids like you are that are going to turn out to be just amazing adults, you got to do the thing. And so I want to say to you, Amber, I want to proclaim over you what I do everyone, but pretend this is for you because it is. And first of all, I love you. I want to say that, but you are seen, you are known, you are heard, you are loved, and you are valued. And there's a song that plays on the outro of my podcast you are one of the people that I think of every time I hear it. And it's a song called Marked by You by Phil Baker. And it talks about lives being marked by God. You are fighting right now, Amber. You're in the ring with Jesus. You're fighting. You're fighting for you. You're fighting for your family. You're fighting for the kingdom of God. And I just want to thank you for that. And so thank you for being here today with us.
Love you, friend. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I love you. I know you need to go get those children as we speak. And so I can't wait for this episode to drop and for folks to hear what you had to say. So thank you so much for being here.
Let my life glow.